Welcome to another episode of Ministry Matters That Matter. In the last episode, I shared with you some car hacks, if you will, for sermon prep. Some things I try to do that are safe to do, but that I do as I'm traveling down the road. I encourage you to make sure that you activate anything you're going to listen to when you're in a parked position, not as you're going down the road and so forth. But in this episode, I'm going to pick up where I left off in the last episode, sharing some things I do to study as I travel. I thank you for joining me for another episode of Ministry Matters That Matter. On audiobooks, I've got the Preaching God's Word app. And if you open that up, let me just go back over here. So
this
here
final chapter of the story of salvation
are a list of the chapters. So I'm listening to Revelation. Let's say I'm going to preach Gospels and Acts.
Revelation is powerful.
So I'm going to go to that chapter.
In this chapter, we'll be talking about preaching the Gospels and Acts, preaching New Testament narrative. You know, everyone loves a good story. Stories capture our attention like nothing else because we find ourselves entering into the story and we identify with the characters in a very personal way.
So what that allows me to do is if I'm going to do a lesson, you've got to remember that he's got chapters in that book on every section of the Bible. So depending on what section of the Bible I'm doing my lesson from, if I'm doing an expository sermon from Esther, then I may be listening to the section where they talk about preaching the history books. If I'm doing an expository sermon from something in the book of Matthew, then I may listen to the section on preaching from the Gospels. All of those things are very, very valuable to me as I am preparing lessons. And so that's just an example of one of the books that I have on Audible and find helpful. Or excuse me, that's actually on audiobooks. Now I want to go from the audiobooks app to the Audible app. And so on Audible, I've got a number of different books. I was listening to the Lord of the Rings story. They had a buy one, get one free, Fellowship of the Ring, and the Two Towers. But let me give you a couple of other examples. So here is the book Biblical Interpretation. And in each one of these chapters, they are dealing with interpreting various parts of the Bible. So it may be law, it may be the Gospels. Here he's talking about the Gospels and how a proper interpretation rules and how you handle the Gospels. And so each of the chapters in the book deal with different chunks of the Bible. So if I'm doing a lesson from those chunks, they are going to help me to dig deeper. I mentioned a few moments the grasping God's Word, or actually I played some audio a few moments ago from the Preaching God's Word book by Duvall and Hayes. This is the Grasping God's Word book, which deals more with the interpretation side. So Grasping God's Word deals with biblical interpretation of different chunks of the Bible, and Preaching God's Word deals with how to preach it. Both of those are very valuable when I am doing a lesson for certain parts of the Bible and I'm traveling down the road.
The Apostle Peter is prominent, whereas in the last section, the Apostle Paul shows up like this. The continuing acts of Jesus through Mark, Luke, and John, but we only have one account of the life of the early church, the book of Acts. The book of Acts is a story.
So this section, they are introducing the book of Acts, giving you an overview of the book of Acts.
It's an exciting story.
And they're talking about some principles to think about as you interpret the book of Acts. And so I can couple that with their book on preaching God's Word, and I kind of have some principles in my mind on interpreting the book of Acts, and then some principles in mind on preaching the book of Acts. There are several other books. I keep books on leadership. I do a lot because of the work I do working in Christian education, and because I do classes on youth ministry. I do a lot of research on culture and cultural trends and on generations, and not just Gen Z and millennials or alphas, which are our little bitty kids, but all the generations and how those generations work together. So I've got a number of books on that I listen to going down the road, and sometimes those types of books will feed into the illustration portion of my sermons. So let me pull it up here and see if I've got some other books here. So for example, one book I've got on here, Eric Metaxas has a book called 7 Men. And in this book, he has several characters. He does a chapter on each of these characters. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, like I was just listening to the one on Jackie Robinson. You know, he's just got several folks. You've got George Washington, William Wilberforce. And so those are great sources of not only learning about leadership. For me, often great illustrations come from listening to those kinds of books. So those are some of the things that, just to give you an idea, that I listen to going down the road, and they can help me tremendously. I also use the voice memo feature. You can tell Siri to start a voice memo, and so if I start a voice memo, I can then share things that are coming to my mind as I'm listening to these various apps or listening through the Bible. Let me see if I can get Siri to do it. Let me stop what I was listening to and get out of that. Siri, would you start a voice memo? As I was reading through Genesis chapter 24 the other day, I noticed that the word Lord was used 16 times, and the emphasis throughout it, as they are looking for a bride for Isaac, is on the role of God in the events that are taking place. So you have this reference to the Lord over and over and over. You have references to the servant of Abraham 3 times worshiping God. 2 times it talks about him worshiping God, and then a 3rd time it's him talking about the fact that he had worshiped and praised God when God answered his prayers. You have an emphasis there. He prayed to God and asked God for direction. He praised God when God answered his prayer. The main character in the chapter, as they're searching for a bride for Isaac, is in fact the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel. So that's something that I observed, and maybe I want to hang on to that for a future lesson. Also, I noticed in Genesis chapter 24 that when the servant prayed that God would help him find a bride, and gave some very specific things that he would look for, and ask God to provide those things so that he would know it was the right woman. As soon as that prayer is over, it says, "Behold," and then it talks about the very woman he had prayed about being at the well. And that word "behold" is found 1,000 times in the Old Testament, and it's a word that carries with it the idea of surprise or something new. It's kind of like he prayed for it, and wow, behold, check that out, there she is. So those are some observations that I made. So Siri, you can end that voice memo. So we ended that voice memo, and I just wanted you to realize that you can do a lot of Bible study. So sometimes you observe things, you think about things. Remember, you're listening to these various books, you're listening to the Bible. Thoughts will pop into your mind. Well, you can't pull out a piece of paper and write it down unless you want to pull over or pull into a rest area. So what I do, I just open a voice memo and share whatever my thoughts are, close the voice memo, and then I can go back and listen to it later and pull some notes from it. So those are some things that I find helpful. Also, I try to be observant going down the road. Of course, you're observant trying to watch other cars in the road itself, but there are all kinds of illustrations that we pass as we're going down the road. You think about, as you're traveling, you may see a car accident, you may see a dog hanging out the passenger side door in a car in front of you. You may see a billboard with something very unique on it. Just all kinds of things around you that could become illustrations for your lessons. And so when you observe something that you think could illustrate something you're studying about and are preparing to preach about, again, just open you a voice memo and share a note. There have been times when I've pulled off to the side of the road and pulled out my camera and took a picture of something, and because I wanted to remember that for an illustration. Or sometimes I saw something going down the road that I thought would be an amazing background for a PowerPoint slide. So I'd pull over, pull out my phone, take a picture, get back in the car, and head on down the road. So these are just a few hacks, just a few things I do that allow me to study even when I'm traveling down the road. I hope you find this helpful. Keep preaching the word. Be diligent in your study and in your preparation and preaching, and just know that you are making a difference. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Ministry Matters That Matter.